The cold bit through Josephine Kerrigan's worn wool coat as she stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that crystallized in the frigid December air of 1883. She had been walking for 3 days since the stagecoach broke an axle 50 miles back, since the driver had taken the only horse and promised to send help that never came, since she had watched the other passenger, an elderly merchant, succumb to the cold on the second night. Her fingers had lost all feeling hours ago, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and somewhere in the last mile, she had stopped caring whether she lived or died. The wind howled across the Nevada desert, a bitter contradiction to the scorching heat these lands knew in summer, and Josephine could no longer remember why she had thought coming west was a good idea. The teaching position in Sacramento that had seemed like salvation after her father's death, and the loss of their Boston home now felt like a cruel joke. She would never see California. She would die here in this white wasteland, alone, and no one would even know to mourn her. Her foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow and she fell forward, her face pressing into the icy powder. For a long moment, she simply lay there, feeling the cold seep deeper into her bones, feeling her heartbeat slow. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, so easy to let go. The pain would stop. The fear would stop. Everything would just stop. She closed her eyes. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, beginning to cover her dark coat, her auburn hair, her still form. Minutes passed. The wind sang its mournful song, then hoofbeats. Distant at first, then closer. A horse's whinny. A man's voice, rough and urgent. Jesus Christ. Strong hands rolled her over. Someone was brushing snow from her face, calling to her, but the words seemed to come from very far away. She felt herself being lifted, felt the warmth of another body against hers, felt the movement of a horse beneath them. She tried to open her eyes, but the effort was too great. "Stay with me," the voice said, and there was something in it, something fierce and determined, that made her want to obey. "Come on, stay with me. We are not far from town now." She felt the rumble of his chest against her back as he spoke, felt strong arms holding her secure in the saddle. The horse moved quickly and she drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of sensation. The creak of leather, the man's steady breathing, the way he kept talking to her, telling her his name was Thomas, telling her she was going to be all right, telling her to hold on just a little longer. When consciousness fully returned, she was lying in a bed piled high with quilts, a fire roaring in a potbelly stove nearby. Her hands and feet burned with a fierce, tingling pain that made her gasp. A woman's face appeared above her, weathered and kind, with silver-streaked brown hair. "There now, you are back with us," the woman said, pressing a cup of warm broth to Josephine's lips. "Drink this slowly. I am Martha Green. My husband Henry and I run the boarding house here in Verdi. Thomas Reeves brought you in about 2 hours ago, more ice than woman. We were not sure you would make it." Josephine's throat was too raw to speak, but she managed to swallow the broth, feeling it warm her from the inside. Her mind was clearing slowly, piecing together what had happened. Someone had found her. Someone had saved her life. "The man," she managed to croak. "Thomas. He is downstairs, wearing a path in my floor with his pacing," Martha said with a slight smile. "He has been up here 4 times already to check on you. I finally told him he had to stay put and let you rest. He has been out riding fence lines for 3 days and is exhausted himself. But I do not think he will sleep until he knows you are truly all right." Over the next few days, as feeling painfully returned to her extremities and the danger of frostbite gradually passed, Josephine learned the story of her rescue. Thomas Reeves was a ranch hand at the Silver Creek Ranch, one of the largest cattle operations in the area. He had been checking the far reaches of the property when he spotted what he first thought was a fallen log in the snow. Something had made him ride closer to investigate, and he had found her just in time. Martha would not let him visit until the third day, insisting that Josephine needed rest more than company. But Josephine found herself thinking about him constantly, wanting to thank the man who had saved her life, curious about the voice that had called her back from the edge of giving up entirely. When Martha finally allowed him to come up to the room, Josephine was sitting up in bed, her hair brushed and braided, wearing a borrowed nightgown and shawl. She heard his boots on the stairs, heard him speaking quietly with Martha, then a soft knock on the door frame. "Come in," she said, and her heart did an unexpected flutter as he stepped into the room. Thomas Reeves was tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. He could not have been more than 25 or 26, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes that were somewhere between brown and gold in the firelight. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and there was something almost boyish in his awkward stance despite his obvious strength. "Miss Kerrigan," he said, his voice the same one that had called to her in the snow. "I am glad to see you looking so much better." "Mr. Reeves," she replied, and was pleased that her voice sounded almost normal now. "I owe you my life. I do not know how to begin to thank you." "No thanks needed," he said quickly, taking a step further into the room but keeping a respectful distance. "Any decent person would have done the same. But you were the one who did it," she insisted. "You saved me when I had given up entirely. You brought me back." Something passed across his face, an emotion she could not quite read. He moved to the chair beside the bed, sitting down only when she gestured for him to do so. "What were you doing out there?" he asked. "Martha said something about a stage coach." Josephine told him the whole story then, about her father's death from pneumonia the previous winter, about losing their Boston home to his debts, about the teaching position she had secured through a newspaper advertisement. She told him about the stage coach breakdown, about the driver who had abandoned them, about watching Mr. Pemberton die from exposure. "I kept thinking I should bury him," she said quietly, staring at her hands. "But the ground was frozen and I had no tools, and I knew if I did not keep walking I would die too, so I just left him there. I put his coat over him and I left him." "You did what you had to do to survive," Thomas said firmly. "He would have wanted that. Would he?" She looked up at him, feeling tears threaten. "I do not know. I barely knew him. We had only spoken a handful of words to each other during the journey, and now he is dead and I am alive, and I cannot quite understand why I deserve that when he did not." Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. "It is not about deserving, Miss Kerrigan. Survival rarely is. You kept walking when you could have stopped. You fought to stay alive. That matters." They talked for over an hour, and Josephine found herself telling him things she had not planned to share, things about her fears and her grief and her uncertainty about what to do now. The teaching position would be long filled by someone else. She had no money for a return ticket to Boston, even if she wanted to go back, which she did not. She was alone in the world with nothing but the clothes she had been wearing, and those had been so damaged by her ordeal that Martha had simply thrown them away. "What will you do?" Thomas asked, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. "I do not know," she admitted. "I suppose I will have to find work here, at least until I can save enough for passage to California. Is there much call for teachers in Verdi?" "There is a schoolhouse," Thomas said slowly, "but the last teacher left 2 months ago to get married, and they have been looking for a replacement ever since. Most of the ranch families have children who need educating. If you wanted, I could introduce you to the school board chairman. He is Marcus Fletcher, the foreman at Silver Creek where I work. Hope fluttered in Josephine's chest. Would you? That would be wonderful. Consider it done, Thomas said, and his smile transformed his serious face into something warm and open. You did not come all this way for nothing, Miss Kerrigan. We will make sure of that. After he left, Josephine lay back against the pillows, feeling something she had not felt in months, possibility. And beneath that, something else she was not quite ready to name, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove and everything to do with the man who had just left the room. By the end of the week, Josephine was strong enough to come downstairs. Martha loaned her a dress, taking it in to fit Josephine's slender frame, and Josephine insisted on helping with chores around the boarding house to earn her keep. Martha protested, but Josephine was firm. She would not be a burden, not when these people had already done so much for her. Thomas came by every day, always with some excuse. He brought her books from the small collection at the ranch bunkhouse. He brought news about the school board, who were eager to meet her. He brought her gloves and a scarf that he said were extra, though she suspected he had bought them new from the general store. On the 8th day after her rescue, he arrived with Marcus Fletcher in tow, a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Over coffee in Martha's parlor, Josephine answered questions about her education, her teaching experience helping at the dame school near her Boston home, her plans and philosophy for education. "You are hired," Marcus said at last, extending his hand. $30 a month plus room and board in the teacherage next to the school. You start after the new year. That gives you 3 weeks to prepare. Josephine shook his hand, hardly daring to believe it. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Thank you so much. I will not disappoint you." "See that you do not," he said gruffly, but his eyes were kind. "We have 15 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. It will not be easy work." After Marcus left, Thomas remained, his face bright with pleasure at her success. "Congratulations, Miss Kerrigan. You see, I told you things would work out." "Thanks to you," she said softly. "None of this would have been possible without you, Mr. Reeves." "Thomas," he said. "Please call me Thomas, and might I call you Josephine?" "I would like that," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. The days until Christmas passed in a pleasant blur. Josephine continued helping Martha at the boarding house, learning the rhythms of frontier life so different from Boston. She learned to bake bread in a wood-fired oven, to preserve food for the winter, to recognize the signs of weather changes in the Nevada sky. And every evening, Thomas would stop by, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for hours, and they would talk. She learned that he was 24, 2 years younger than her own 26, that he had come west from Missouri 5 years ago after his parents died of typhoid fever. He had worked on ranches across 3 states before settling at Silver Creek 2 years ago. He was saving money, he told her, to eventually buy his own land and start his own small ranch, though that dream was still years away. "What do you want from life, Josephine?" He asked her one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor, the Christmas tree that Martha and Henry had decorated filling the room with the scent of pine. Josephine considered the question carefully. "A month ago, I would have said security, stability, a place where I belonged. But now I think I want more than that. I want to matter. I want to do work that means something. I want to not be afraid anymore." "Afraid of what?" "Everything," she admitted. "I have been afraid for so long. Afraid when my father was dying and I could not help him. Afraid when the creditors came and took our house. Afraid on that stagecoach, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Afraid in the snow, knowing I was going to die. I am tired of being afraid." Thomas reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, and the touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "You are the bravest person I know," he said quietly. "You kept walking when anyone else would have stopped. You kept fighting. That is not the action of someone who lets fear win." "I was ready to give up," she whispered. "If you had come 5 minutes later, I would have been dead. But I did not come 5 minutes later. I came exactly when I was supposed to. Do you not see, Josephine? We were meant to find each other. I do not believe in much, but I believe in that." She looked at him, at his earnest face in the firelight, and felt something shift in her chest. "I believe it too," she said. Christmas came, and Martha insisted that Josephine join their small celebration. Thomas was there as well, along with a few of the other ranch hands who had nowhere else to go for the holiday. They ate roast chicken and potatoes, sang carols around the piano that one of the boarders played, and exchanged small gifts. Thomas gave Josephine a journal, the pages blank and full of possibility. "For your new life," he said simply, "so you can write down all the adventures you are going to have." She gave him a scarf she had knitted in the evenings, her fingers still clumsy from the frostbite but determined to create something for him. When he wrapped it around his neck, his eyes warm with pleasure, she felt happy in a way she had not felt in years. As the evening wound down and the other guests retired to their rooms, Thomas and Josephine found themselves alone by the fire. The snow was falling again outside, soft and gentle this time, nothing like the blizzard that had nearly killed her. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said, his voice low and serious. "I know it has only been a few weeks and maybe it is too soon, but I cannot keep it to myself any longer. Josephine, from the moment I saw you in the snow, something in me changed. When I lifted you onto my horse, when I held you against me and felt your heartbeat getting weaker, I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life. And when you opened your eyes again, when I knew you were going to live, I felt something I had never felt before." Her heart was racing. "What did you feel?" "Hope," he said simply. "Real hope. Not just the vague idea that things might get better someday, but the absolute certainty that they already had, because you were in the world, because I had found you. Because even though you had been ready to give up, you chose to fight when I asked you to stay with me. Josephine, I am in love with you. I know it is too soon. I know you probably do not feel the same way, but I had to tell you. I had to be honest." For a moment, Josephine could not breathe. Then she leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him. His lips were warm and soft, and when his arms came around her, she felt like she had finally come home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, "It is not too soon, and I do feel the same way. I think I have been falling in love with you since I first heard your voice calling me back from the dark. You gave me my life back, Thomas. You gave me hope when I had none left. How could I not love you?" They sat together until late into the night, making plans and dreaming dreams, and when Thomas finally left to return to the ranch, Josephine touched her fingers to her lips and smiled. The new year arrived with crisp, clear weather. Josephine moved into the small teacherage, a modest 2-room building that was freezing cold but had good bones. Thomas spent his one day off helping her prepare the schoolroom, repairing broken desks, fixing windows that did not close properly, carrying in wood for the stove. "I could get used to this," she said as they worked side by side, him hammering nails while she swept the floor. "To what? Working with you, being with you, this feeling that I am not alone anymore." He set down his hammer and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms despite the dust covering them both. "You will never be alone again. I promise you that, Josephine. Whatever happens, wherever life takes us, we face it together." She believed him. School began in early January, and Josephine threw herself into teaching with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. The children were rough around the edges, some barely literate, but they were eager to learn. There was Billy Fletcher, Marcus's 8-year-old grandson, who could barely sit still but had a brilliant mind for arithmetic. There was Sarah Chen, the 12-year-old daughter of the ranch's Chinese cook, who spoke perfect English but had never learned to read. There were the Miller twins, rebellious 14-year-olds who tested her patience daily but gradually came around when they realized she would not give up on them. Thomas came by the school most afternoons after finishing his work at the ranch, often bringing firewood or some small repair that needed doing. The children quickly figured out that their teacher was being courted by the ranch hand, and they teased her about it mercilessly, but kindly. "When are you going to marry him, Miss Kerrigan?" little Emily Sanderson asked one day, all innocence and curiosity. Josephine felt her face heat. "That is not an appropriate question, Emily. But you are going to, are you not?" Billy chimed in. "Everyone says so." "My grandpa says Mr. Reeves has not stopped smiling since Christmas." "That is enough discussion of my personal life," Josephine said firmly, but she could not quite keep the smile off her face. "Now, who can tell me what we learned about the Revolutionary War yesterday?" That evening, when Thomas arrived, she told him about the conversation and he laughed, the sound warm and rich. "Well, they are not wrong," he said. "I would marry you tomorrow if you would have me, but I know it is too soon. We should wait, give you time to be sure, give us time to save some money and plan properly." "What if I do not want to wait?" Josephine said, surprising herself with her boldness. Thomas stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I almost died alone in the snow. I am saying that life is short and uncertain. I am saying that I have never been more sure of anything than I am of you. So yes, Thomas Reeves, I will marry you. Tomorrow, next week, next month, whenever you want. The answer is yes." He kissed her then, long and deep, and when they broke apart, he was grinning like a fool. "March. Let us get married in March when winter is breaking and spring is coming. Let us start our new life together when everything else is beginning again too." They announced their engagement the next week, and the small community of Verde celebrated as if it were their own good fortune. Martha cried and hugged them both, declaring that she had known from the first day that they were meant for each other. Marcus Fletcher, in a rare show of sentiment, shook Thomas's hand and told him he was a lucky man. Even the children at school made cards and drawings to congratulate their teacher. The months between January and March passed both slowly and quickly. Thomas continued his work at the ranch, but he was saving every penny now, planning for their future. Josephine continued teaching, growing more confident in her abilities with each passing week. In the evenings, they would meet at the boarding house parlor, which Martha had unofficially designated as their courting space, and they would talk for hours. They talked about everything: childhood memories and lost loved ones, dreams for the future and fears about the present, silly things and serious things and everything in between. Thomas told her about the small piece of land he had his eye on, 20 acres on the edge of the Silver Creek property that the owner had mentioned he might be willing to sell. Josephine told him about her hope to one day establish a lending library in Verde so that everyone, not just the wealthy, could access books. "We could do it together," Thomas said. "Build something that lasts, something that matters." "We will," Josephine agreed. "We already are." One cold February evening, Thomas arrived at the boarding house looking troubled. Josephine felt a spike of worry when she saw his face. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. "Nothing is wrong exactly," he said slowly. "But I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not change how you feel about me." They sat down, and Josephine took his hands. "Tell me. You know I came west from Missouri 5 years ago after my parents died." What I did not tell you is why I left so quickly, why I have been moving from place to place until I settled here. Josephine, my father, was not a good man. He drank heavily, and when he drank, he became violent. He hurt my mother. He hurt me. When they both died, I felt terrible guilt because part of me was relieved. Part of me was glad they were gone, that the fear and the pain had ended. What kind of person feels that way about their own parents? Josephine's heart ached for him. She squeezed his hands tighter. A person who was hurt. A person who survived. Thomas, what you felt was natural. It does not make you a bad person, it makes you human. There is more, he said. The night before I left Missouri, my father's brother, my uncle, he came to the house. He was drunk too, always was. He said terrible things about my mother, said she had deserved what happened to her. And I hit him. I hit him hard enough that he fell and did not get up for a long time. I thought I had killed him. I left town that night and I never went back. I do not know if he was all right or not. I do not know if there is a warrant for my arrest somewhere. I have been running from that moment ever since, even though I finally stopped moving when I came to Verdi. Did you mean to kill him? Josephine asked quietly. No, I just wanted him to stop talking. I wanted him to stop saying those things. Then you did nothing wrong. You defended your mother's memory. You defended yourself. And even if your uncle was badly hurt, which I doubt, no one could blame you for it. Thomas, we have both survived terrible things. We both carry scars. But that is precisely why we understand each other. You do not have to be perfect. You just have to be honest, which you have been. And I love you exactly as you are. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I do not deserve you. Yes, you do, she said firmly. We deserve each other. We deserve happiness after everything we have been through, and we are going to have it. March arrived with tentative warmth, the snow finally beginning to melt from the higher elevations. Martha had thrown herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm, sewing Josephine a dress of soft blue wool that brought out her eyes, arranging for the ceremony to take place in the boarding house parlor since Verdi had no church yet. The night before the wedding, Josephine lay awake in her room at the treacherous, thinking about how dramatically her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been in Boston, preparing for her father's funeral, losing everything she had known. 4 months ago, she had been dying in the snow, ready to give up on life entirely. And now, tomorrow, she would marry the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. She thought about that moment when she had fallen in the snow, when she had closed her eyes and decided to let go. If she had given up even a minute earlier, if Thomas had ridden past even a minute later, she would be dead. They would never have met. They would never have fallen in love. The children she taught would have a different teacher, and Thomas would still be alone, saving money for a dream that felt distant and impossible. But none of that had happened. She had held on and he had found her, and together they had discovered something neither of them had expected. A reason to hope. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to promise good things. Josephine dressed in her new gown, pinned up her hair with combs that Martha loaned her, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked happy. She looked alive. She looked like a woman on the edge of a wonderful adventure. The ceremony was simple but perfect. Judge Morrison, who traveled through Verdi twice a month to hold court, presided. Martha and Henry stood as witnesses. Marcus Fletcher was there, along with a dozen ranch hands and most of the school families. The children sat in the front row, grinning and whispering excitedly. Thomas stood at the front of the room in his best clothes, which he had clearly bought new for the occasion, his hair neatly combed, his eyes locked on Josephine as she walked toward him. When she reached him and he took her hands, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Dearly beloved," Judge Morrison began, but Josephine barely heard the words. She was too focused on Thomas, on the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, on the way his hands trembled slightly in hers. They spoke their vows clearly and firmly, promises to love and honor and cherish, promises to stand together through whatever came. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with such tenderness that several people in the audience openly wept. The celebration afterward was joyous and loud, with music and dancing and far too much food. Josephine danced with Thomas, with Marcus, with Henry, with several of the ranch hands. She laughed more than she had laughed in years. She felt weightless and grounded all at once, as if she were exactly where she was meant to be. As the evening drew to a close, Thomas and Josephine walked together to the small house that Thomas had been renting on the edge of town, which would be their home now. The night was cool but not cold, and the stars were brilliant overhead. "I never thought I could be this happy," Josephine said quietly as they walked. "I never thought it was possible." "Neither did I," Thomas admitted. "For the longest time, I thought I was broken somehow, that I was not capable of this. But then I found you, and everything changed." Inside their little house, they held each other close, and Josephine thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. 6 months ago, she had been giving up, letting the cold take her. Tonight, she was warmer than she had ever been, held in the arms of a man who loved her, beginning a life that was full of possibility. The next months of marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Josephine continued teaching, though she now walked to school from the house she shared with Thomas rather than from the teacherage. Thomas continued working at the ranch, but he was no longer saving alone. They were building their future together, $1 at a time. They learned each other's rhythms and habits. Josephine learned that Thomas was an early riser who liked to sit with coffee and watch the sunrise before heading to work. Thomas learned that Josephine was a voracious reader who would often stay up long past bedtime if she had a good book. They learned to navigate small disagreements, how to communicate when one was upset or worried, how to comfort and support each other. In May, Thomas came home with news that made Josephine's heart leap. The owner of Silver Creek Ranch had agreed to sell him the 20 acres of land Thomas had been eyeing, at a price they could afford with the savings they had combined. It would take everything they had, but the land would be theirs, and they could begin building their own ranch. "Are you sure?" Josephine asked, even though she could see the answer in his shining eyes. "It is a huge risk." "I am sure," Thomas said firmly. "I have been working for other men my whole life. It is time to build something of our own. What do you think?" "I think we should do it," Josephine said, feeling excitement bubble up inside her. "I think we should take the risk and build something wonderful." They purchased the land in June, and Thomas immediately began planning. He would continue working at Silver Creek for wages while slowly building up their own herd. He would use his days off and evenings to build a proper house on their land, to put up fences, to do all the 1,000 tasks that needed doing. Josephine insisted on helping. After school let out for the summer at the end of June, she spent her days working alongside Thomas, learning skills she never would have imagined needing in her Boston life. She learned to hammer nails straight, to dig post holes, to recognize which plants were good for grazing and which were not. Her hands developed calluses and her skin tanned, despite the bonnet she wore. She was stronger than she had ever been, both physically and in spirit. On July 4th, they took a break from their work to attend the celebration in Verdi. There were races and competitions. A shooting contest that Thomas entered but did not win. A pie baking contest that Josephine entered and came in third place. In the evening, They all gathered to watch fireworks that someone had brought in from Carson City, brilliant bursts of color against the darkening sky. As Josephine stood watching the fireworks, Thomas's arm around her waist, she thought about the previous year's Independence Day. She had still been in Boston then, her father recently buried, sorting through his papers and trying to figure out what to do with her life. She had felt so hopeless then, so lost. She never could have imagined that 1 year later, she would be standing under Nevada stars with a husband she loved and a future she had built with her own hands. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, seeming to sense the thoughtful mood that had come over her. "How grateful I am," she said simply, "for all of this, for you, for the life we are building, for being alive." He kissed her temple. "I am grateful too, every single day." By the end of summer, they had built a small but sturdy house on their property, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. They also had a barn, a chicken coop, and corrals for the cattle they did not have yet. Thomas had been able to purchase 3 young heifers and 1 bull from Marcus, who sold them at a steep discount as a wedding gift. It was not much, but it was a start. They moved into their new house in September, and Josephine felt a pride of ownership she had never experienced before. This was not rented space or borrowed shelter. This was their home, built with their own labor, standing on their own land. When she taught school now, she rode a horse the 3 miles from their ranch to town, a skill Thomas had patiently taught her during the summer. The school year began again, and Josephine found that she loved teaching even more in her 2nd year than in her 1st. She knew her students better now, understood their strengths and challenges. She had a reputation in the community as a good teacher, someone who was both firm and kind, who had high expectations but also deep compassion. Thomas's work at Silver Creek continued, though Marcus had promoted him to a better position with higher wages in recognition of his reliability and skill. He spent his free time improving their ranch, always planning the next project, the next improvement. He talked about eventually being able to work their own land full-time, about building up a herd that could support them without outside employment. In November, Josephine realized that something had changed in her body. She was tired in a way she could not explain, and certain smells that had never bothered her before now made her feel queasy. It took her another week to admit the possibility, and another week after that to confirm it with Martha, who had served as midwife to half the babies in the region. "You are expecting," Martha said with a broad smile. "I would guess about 2 months along. Congratulations, dear." Josephine walked home in a daze, trying to process this new reality. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She and Thomas were going to be parents. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. She told Thomas that evening over dinner, just blurting it out because she could not figure out how to say it gracefully. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby. In June, Martha thinks." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her. Then a huge grin spread across his face, and he was out of his chair and lifting her up, spinning her around the small kitchen. "A baby. Josephine, we are going to have a baby," she laughed, dizzy from the spinning and the joy on his face. "Are you happy? I know we did not plan this so soon." "Happy, I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled. We are going to be parents." He set her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Are you all right? How are you feeling? Should you be sitting down? What do you need?" "I need you to stop fussing," she said, kissing him. "I am pregnant, not made of glass." "But yes, I am all right. I am better than all right. I am happy too." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Josephine continued teaching until March, when her growing belly made it too difficult to move comfortably around the classroom. The school board hired a temporary replacement for the last few months of the term, with the understanding that Josephine would return in the fall if she was able. Those last months of pregnancy were a strange, suspended time. Josephine spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes, arranging the loft space into a nursery of sorts. Thomas had built a beautiful cradle during the long winter evenings, working on it in secret and presenting it to her with shy pride. They talked about names endlessly. Thomas wanted to name a boy after his mother's father, a man who had been kind to him when his own father was cruel. Josephine wanted to name a girl after her mother, who had died when Josephine was only 12. They finally agreed that they would wait until the baby was born and see what name seemed right. In early June, as the desert heat began to settle over Nevada, Josephine's pains began. Thomas rode for Martha while Josephine tried to stay calm, breathing through the contractions that were coming stronger and faster. Martha arrived quickly, efficient and unflappable, and Thomas was banished to wait outside. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. There were moments when Josephine thought she could not bear it, when the pain was so intense that she understood why women feared childbirth. But Martha's voice was steady, telling her she was doing well, telling her it would be over soon, telling her to push just one more time. And finally, as the sun rose over their small ranch, a baby's cry filled the house. Martha wrapped the infant and placed the bundle in Josephine's arms. "You have a son," she said softly. "A healthy, perfect baby boy." Josephine looked down at the tiny red face, at the eyes that were trying to focus, at the small fists waving indignantly. Her son. Their son. A wave of love so powerful it was almost frightening washed over her. This tiny person was depending on her completely. She would do anything to protect him. Thomas was allowed back inside, and when he saw Josephine holding their baby, his face crumpled. He knelt beside the bed, staring at his son with wonder. "Can I hold him?" Josephine carefully transferred the baby to Thomas's arms, and watching her strong, capable husband cradle their newborn with such tenderness made her heart overflow. "We made this," she said softly. "Can you believe it? We made an entire person." "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They looked at their son, considering. Finally, Josephine said, "What about James? It was your grandfather's name and my father's middle name. It feels right." "James Reeves," Thomas said, testing it out. "Yes, that is exactly right." "Welcome to the world, James. We are your parents, and we are going to love you so much." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in ways they could never have anticipated. James was a healthy baby with strong lungs, and he made his needs known loudly and frequently. Josephine and Thomas learned to function on broken sleep, to change diapers quickly, to soothe a crying infant in the middle of the night. Josephine marveled at how much her life had transformed. 2 years ago, she had been a desperate woman dying in the snow, convinced her life was over. Now she was a wife, a mother, a teacher, a rancher. She had a family and a home and a purpose. The contrast was staggering. Thomas was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son. He would hold James for hours, talking to him about the ranch, about the cattle they would raise, about all the things they would do together. Watching them together, Josephine would sometimes feel tears prick her eyes at the sheer goodness of it all. In September, Josephine returned to teaching, bringing James with her to school. She set up a crib in the corner of the classroom, and the older students took turns holding the baby and helping care for him. It was unorthodox, but the parents understood, and the children were thrilled to have a baby as part of their school day. The ranch continued to grow slowly. Thomas had been able to purchase more cattle, and their small herd was beginning to thrive. He still worked at Silver Creek part-time, but more and more of his energy went into their own operation. He talked about the day when they would be fully self-sufficient, when the ranch could support them entirely. James's first birthday came in June of 1885, and they had a small celebration at their home. The children from school came with their families, and Marcus brought the ranch hands. They ate cake that Josephine had baked, and James smashed his slice with enthusiastic glee, getting more on his face than in his mouth. "Can you believe it has been a year?" Thomas said that evening after everyone had left and James was asleep in his cradle. "It feels like yesterday that he was born and also like he has always been here." "I know," Josephine agreed. "Time is strange that way. It feels like another lifetime ago that I was walking through that snow, thinking my life was over, and yet it has only been 2.5 years. Thomas pulled her close. "That day changed everything. Finding you changed everything. You gave me a reason to hope, Josephine. You gave me a future I never thought I could have. You gave me those things too," she said softly. "When you lifted me from the snow, you lifted my hope as well." We saved each other, Thomas. As the years passed, life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. In 1886, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again, and this time there was less surprise and more excitement. Their daughter was born in early 1887, a tiny thing with her mother's auburn hair and her father's golden brown eyes. They named her Sarah, after Thomas's mother, and she was doted on by her older brother James, who took his role as protective sibling very seriously. Thomas finally left his position at Silver Creek in 1888, as their ranch had grown enough to support them. They had a respectable herd of 40 cattle now, enough to bring in income from regular sales. Thomas hired a young ranch hand to help with the work, a 16-year-old orphan named Daniel who reminded Thomas of himself at that age. He paid the boy fair wages and taught him everything he knew, determined to be the kind of employer he had always wished for. Josephine continued teaching, though she reduced her hours to 3 days a week so she could spend more time at home with the children. The school board had finally hired a second teacher to help with the growing student population, which made it possible for Josephine to have a more flexible schedule. In 1889, they started the lending library that Josephine had always dreamed about. It was small, just a room attached to the school, but it was filled with books that people from all over the region donated. Josephine organized it carefully, creating a system for borrowing and returning books. It became a hub of the community, a place where people could come not just for books but for conversation and connection. Their third child, a son they named Samuel, was born in 1890. With 3 children under 7 years old, the house felt very full and very loud. Thomas added on 2 more rooms, and they slowly improved their home, adding touches of comfort and beauty. Josephine planted flowers in front of the house, and Thomas built her a vegetable garden that provided fresh produce through the summer and early fall. The ranch continued to prosper. Thomas's careful management and hard work had paid off, and they were now considered one of the successful small operations in the region. They had built something lasting, something they could pass on to their children. On a December evening in 1891, Josephine stood in the doorway of their home, watching the first snow of the season fall. It had been 8 years since Thomas had found her dying in snow just like this. 8 years since she had given up hope, since he had lifted her and that hope together. She heard Thomas come up behind her, felt his arms wrap around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, a question he had asked hundreds of times over the years. "How far we have come," she said. "How different everything is from that day in the snow." "I am watching snow fall, Thomas, and I am not afraid. I am warm and safe and loved. We have built this incredible life together. Sometimes I can hardly believe it is real." "It is real," he assured her, "and it is only going to get better. We have years and years ahead of us, Josephine. A whole lifetime of moments like this." From inside the house came the sound of children laughing, James chasing Sarah while baby Samuel clapped his chubby hands. The fire crackled in the hearth. The ranch was secure for the winter, the livestock all safe in the barn. Everything they needed was right here, within these walls and on this land they had built together. "I love you," Josephine said, turning in Thomas's arms to face him. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," he replied. "From that first moment in the snow until my last breath, I will love you. You are my miracle, Josephine, the best thing that ever happened to me." They kissed as the snow fell around them, and Josephine thought about the mystery and wonder of life, how quickly things could change, how hope could bloom in the most unlikely places. She had been dying when Thomas found her, but he had not just saved her life. He had given her a reason to live it fully, passionately, joyfully. The years continued to unfold with their share of joys and challenges. In 1893, Marcus Fletcher retired as foreman of Silver Creek Ranch and sold his house in town, moving to California to live with his daughter. Before he left, he came to visit Thomas and Josephine at their ranch. "I wanted to tell you both how proud I am of what you have built here," he said, looking around at the thriving operation. "Thomas, when I first hired you, I saw a hard-working young man, but you have become so much more than that. You are a skilled rancher, a good employer, a devoted husband and father, and Josephine, you have done more for education in this region than anyone else. You should both be very proud." "We learned from the best," Thomas said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "Thank you for everything, Marcus. For giving me a chance, for introducing me to the school board, for all of it." After Marcus left, Josephine felt a bittersweet pang. He had been such an important part of their early story, one of the first people to believe in them. But life moved forward and people moved on, and that was natural. James was now 8 years old and showing signs of being a natural rancher like his father. He loved working with the cattle and horses, loved being outdoors, loved learning everything Thomas could teach him. Sarah, at 6, was more interested in books and learning, often accompanying Josephine to school and sitting quietly in the back of the classroom with her own studies. Samuel, at 3, was still figuring out who he would be, but he was cheerful and affectionate, the baby of the family, even though Josephine suspected he would not hold that title much longer. In the spring of 1894, Josephine confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant with their 4th child. This time, the pregnancy felt different, harder on her body now that she was 37 years old. She tired more easily and had to cut back even further on her teaching hours. The baby would be born in late fall, and she spent the summer preparing, sewing clothes and arranging the house to accommodate another child. Their daughter Emily was born in November 1894, a tiny, delicate baby who looked nothing like her robust siblings. She was healthy but small, and Josephine felt fiercely protective of her from the first moment. Thomas was equally smitten, and watching him with this little girl who wrapped her tiny fingers around his calloused ones made Josephine fall in love with him all over again. The children adored their new sister. James, now 9, was careful and gentle with her. Sarah, 7, wanted to help with everything. Even 3-year-old Samuel seemed to understand that Emily needed special care and would bring her his favorite toys. Life with 4 children was chaotic and exhausting, but it was also full of laughter and love. The house was never quiet, never still. There were always meals to prepare, clothes to wash, children to discipline and comfort and teach. Thomas and Josephine worked as a team, supporting each other through the endless demands of parenthood and ranching. In 1896, tragedy struck the community when a severe drought hit the region. The grazing lands dried up, water sources became scarce, and many ranchers struggled to keep their herds alive. Thomas made the difficult decision to sell off half their cattle at unfavorable prices rather than watch them starve. It was a significant financial setback. Years of work lost to the merciless weather. Josephine watched her husband struggle with the decision, saw the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. One night, after he had sold the last of the cattle they could not support, she found him sitting outside staring at the stars. "We will rebuild," she said, sitting beside him. "We have done it before. We started with nothing, remember? We will do it again." "I feel like I have failed," Thomas admitted, his voice rough. "I was supposed to provide for our family, to build something lasting, and instead I am watching it slip away." "You have not failed," Josephine said firmly. "You made the smart choice. You saved the cattle we could save and let go of the ones we could not. That takes wisdom and courage. We still have our land, our home, each other, our children. Those are the things that truly matter. The herd can be rebuilt. What we have together cannot be replaced." He pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other as they always had. The drought would pass. They would recover. They had survived worse. The drought finally broke in the spring of 1897, and Thomas slowly began rebuilding the herd. It would take time, but he was patient and determined. Daniel, their ranch hand who had been with them for nearly a decade now, stayed on even when Thomas could barely afford to pay him, showing a loyalty that Thomas never forgot. The children were growing. James, at 12, was increasingly capable of doing real ranch work. Sarah, at 10, had surpassed Josephine in reading level and was devouring every book in the lending library. Samuel, at 7, had revealed himself to be mechanically inclined, always figuring out how things worked and taking them apart to see inside. Emily, at 3, was still small for her age but bright and curious, asking endless questions about everything. Josephine had cut back her teaching to just one day a week after Emily was born, and in 1898 she made the decision to retire from teaching entirely. It was a bittersweet choice. She had loved teaching, loved her students, loved feeling like she was making a difference in young lives. But her own children needed her more now, and she wanted to be fully present for them. On her last day of teaching, the community threw her a celebration, thanking her for 15 years of service. She received letters from former students, now grown, telling her how she had changed their lives. It was overwhelming and beautiful, and she cried happy tears as she read each message. That evening, Thomas presented her with a gift, a wooden sign he had carved himself that read Kerrigan Reeves Ranch. "We built this together," he said. "Your name belongs on it as much as mine. This is your legacy too, Josephine. Everything we have, we created side by side." She hung the sign over the door with pride, and every time she looked at it, she thought about the journey they had traveled together. The turn of the century came with a mixture of reflection and anticipation. In 1900, as the world celebrated entering a new age, Josephine and Thomas celebrated 17 years of marriage. They were both in their early 40s now, no longer the young people who had fallen in love in the wake of disaster. They had gray in their hair and lines on their faces, the marks of years spent working hard and living fully. Their oldest, James, was now 15 and making noises about wanting to expand the ranch, to try new breeding techniques he had read about. Sarah, at 13, had announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother had been. Samuel, at 10, was building elaborate contraptions out of wire and wood, his mind always working on some new invention. Emily, at 6, was finally catching up in size to other children her age and had developed a passion for drawing, creating elaborate pictures of the ranch and the family. "We made good humans," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "They are kind and smart and hardworking. I think we did all right." "Better than all right," Josephine agreed. "They are wonderful. Each one of them is exactly who they are supposed to be." In 1902, Daniel married a young woman from town, and Thomas and Josephine were witnesses at the small ceremony. Afterward, Thomas offered Daniel a partnership in the ranch, a percentage of the profits in addition to his wages. Daniel had been loyal through the drought years, had worked tirelessly to help rebuild. He deserved to share in the success he had helped create. The ranch was thriving again by 1903, larger even than it had been before the drought. They had 70 head of cattle now, good breeding stock that commanded premium prices. Thomas had purchased more land, expanding their property to 40 acres. They had hired 2 more hands to help with the work. The Kerrigan Reeves Ranch was known throughout the region as a well-run operation that treated its workers fairly and produced quality livestock. James, now 18, had become his father's right hand in running the ranch. He was engaged to a sweet girl from town named Catherine, and they planned to marry in the spring of 1904. Thomas and Josephine were building a small house on the property for the young couple, knowing that James would take over more and more responsibility as the years went on. Sarah, at 16, had started helping at the school as an assistant teacher, learning the profession she planned to pursue. She was brilliant and patient, a natural educator. Josephine watched her daughter with pride, seeing herself in Sarah but also seeing someone entirely unique. Samuel, at 13, had shocked everyone by building a working water pump that significantly improved their irrigation system. His mechanical aptitude was becoming legendary, and several people in town had commissioned him to build or repair various devices. Josephine suspected that Samuel would not stay on the ranch long term, that his talents would take him elsewhere. And while that thought made her sad, she also felt excited for the adventures he would have. Emily, at 9, was attending school in town and excelling in art. Her teacher had said she had real talent, and Thomas and Josephine encouraged her to pursue it. They had learned that each child needed to follow their own path, that trying to force them into predetermined roles only led to unhappiness. In the spring of 1904, James married Catherine in a beautiful ceremony on the ranch. The whole community came out to celebrate. Josephine watched her firstborn son exchange vows with his bride, and she thought about her own wedding day 21 years earlier, how young and uncertain she and Thomas had been. James and Catherine seemed more confident, but they were also stepping into a different world, one where the ranch was already established, where their path was clearer. After the wedding, as guests danced and celebrated, Thomas pulled Josephine away from the crowd. They walked to the spot where their original small house had stood, before they had built the larger home they lived in now. The old house was still there, used for storage, but it held so many memories. "I stood right here the day we finished building this," Thomas said softly. "And I thought I had everything I could ever want. I had you, I had our first home, I had a future, but I had no idea how much more there would be, how much richer and fuller life would become." "I know," Josephine said, leaning against him. "That day in the snow when I had given up, when I thought my life was over. If someone had told me that 21 years later, I would be standing here at my son's wedding on land that we own, surrounded by a family we created, I never would have believed them. It would have seemed like an impossible dream. "But it is not a dream," Thomas said. "It is real. We made it real, together." They kissed, and from the celebration behind them, they heard their children laughing. James and Catherine were dancing their first dance as a married couple. Sarah was talking animatedly with a group of her students. Samuel was showing some contraption to a group of fascinated guests. Emily was drawing pictures for anyone who wanted one. "We did good," Josephine said. "We built something that will last beyond us." These children, this ranch, the library, the students I taught over the years. This is our legacy, Thomas. This is what we created when we chose not to give up, when we chose to hope. "When I chose to lift you from the snow, I lifted hope as well," Thomas said, echoing the thought that had become almost a refrain between them over the years. "And you lifted me right back. We saved each other, Josephine. We gave each other a reason to keep going." The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and celebrations and ordinary moments that added up to an extraordinary life. Catherine gave birth to Thomas and Josephine's first grandchild in 1905, a boy they named Thomas after his grandfather. Holding the tiny baby who bore his name, Thomas had tears streaming down his face. "I am a grandfather," he kept saying in wonder. "We are grandparents, Josephine." Sarah left for normal school in Carson City in 1906 to get her teaching certificate, and Josephine missed her daughter terribly, but was so proud of her for pursuing her dreams. Samuel, now 16, had been offered an apprenticeship with a master carpenter in Reno who specialized in building innovative farm equipment. It was an opportunity too good to pass up, and though it hurt to see him leave, Josephine and Thomas encouraged him to go. Emily, at 12, was the only child left at home now, and in some ways it felt like starting over. She was different from her siblings, quieter and more introspective, but she had a depth to her that Josephine recognized and appreciated. They spent long hours together, Josephine teaching her daughter not just art, but everything she knew about life, about resilience, about finding joy even in difficult circumstances. In 1908, James and Catherine had a daughter, and the ranch was filled with the sound of children again. Sarah returned from normal school with her teaching certificate and took a position at the Verde School, following in her mother's footsteps. Samuel sent letters from Reno describing his work and the incredible innovations he was learning about. Emily, at 14, was creating artwork that people actually wanted to buy, selling pieces to tourists passing through Nevada on their way to California. Thomas turned 50 in 1909, and Josephine threw him a surprise party that brought together everyone they had known and loved over their years in Nevada. Looking around at the gathered crowd, at the friends and family and community they were part of, Josephine felt overwhelming gratitude. This life, this beautiful, complicated, wonderful life, was more than she ever could have imagined for herself. The second decade of the new century brought changes both joyful and sorrowful. In 1910, Martha Green passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Josephine wept for the woman who had been like a mother to her, who had nursed her back to health and helped her find her place in this new world. Henry followed his wife just 6 months later, and Josephine and Thomas mourned the loss of two people who had been instrumental in their love story. But there were joys, too. James and Catherine had another child, a son. Sarah married a fellow teacher named Robert in 1911, and they settled in Verde to raise their family. Samuel came home for visits, bringing with him prototypes of the equipment he was designing, equipment that was beginning to revolutionize farming and ranching across the West. Emily, at 17, had been offered a scholarship to study art in San Francisco, and though it meant she would be far from home, Josephine and Thomas insisted she go. "You have to follow your dreams," Josephine told her youngest daughter as they packed her trunk for the journey. You have to see what you are capable of creating. We will be here when you come home to visit, but do not let fear hold you back from experiencing everything life has to offer." In 1912, Thomas and Josephine celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a huge celebration. James gave a speech thanking his parents for building something lasting that he was proud to carry on. Sarah talked about how her mother had inspired her to become a teacher. Samuel sent a letter read aloud by Thomas, expressing gratitude for parents who had encouraged him to pursue his unconventional path. Emily came home from San Francisco with a painting she had created of the ranch house in winter, snow falling gently, and it was so beautiful that Josephine cried. 25 years, Thomas said in his own speech, his arm around Josephine's waist. When I found my wife dying in the snow on that December day in 1883, I could never have imagined that we would be standing here today, surrounded by all of you, celebrating a life we built together from nothing. Josephine, you are the love of my life, my partner, my best friend. Everything good that has happened to me has happened because you said yes when I asked you to stay with me that day, and every day since. As their friends and family applauded, Josephine leaned into Thomas, feeling the solidity of him, the strength that had never wavered in all their years together. They had been through so much: near death, drought, financial struggles, the pains of watching children grow up and leave home. But they had faced it all together, and that had made all the difference. The years from 1913 to 1920 brought the fullness that comes with middle age and grandparenthood. More grandchildren arrived, the ranch continued to prosper, and Thomas and Josephine settled into a comfortable rhythm. They were no longer the primary laborers on the ranch. James had taken over most of the day-to-day operations with Daniel as his partner. But Thomas still worked every day, still put his hands to the land he loved. Josephine had returned to teaching part-time, filling in when the school needed substitute teachers, and she had started a reading program for adults in the community who had never learned. It was fulfilling work, using her skills to help people better their lives, and it gave her a sense of purpose beyond being a wife and mother and grandmother. In 1920, as they were approaching their 60s, Thomas became ill. It started as a persistent cough that would not go away, then developed into something more serious. The doctor from Carson City diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest, which was nearly impossible for a man like Thomas, who had worked hard his entire life. Josephine nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside, bringing him broth and medicine, reading to him from the books they both loved. "I am not ready to leave you," Thomas said one night when the fever was high and he was struggling to breathe. "Then do not leave," Josephine said fiercely, gripping his hand. "You fought for me once in the snow, now I am fighting for you. You are going to get better, Thomas Reeves. We have more years ahead of us. We have more grandchildren to meet, more sunsets to watch, more life to live." He did get better. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, the fever broke and his strength returned. By spring, he was back on his feet, though a bit frailer than before. The illness had reminded them both of their mortality, of the fact that their time, while hopefully long, was not infinite. "We should write down our story," Josephine said one evening as they sat together on the porch, "so that our grandchildren and their grandchildren will know how we found each other, how we built this life." Over the next year, they did just that. Josephine wrote in the journal that Thomas had given her on their first Christmas together, now worn and well used, filling the remaining pages with the story of their love. She wrote about the snow and the rescue, about falling in love and building the ranch, about the children and the struggles and the joys. Thomas added his own memories, his perspective on their shared history. When they finished, They had a complete account of their life together, a love story that had begun in desperation and grown into something beautiful and lasting. They gave copies to each of their children, wanting them to have this record of where they came from, of the resilience and hope that were their inheritance. The 1920s brought the roar of a new era, but life on the ranch remained much as it had always been. Thomas and Josephine were in their 60s now, content to let James run the ranch while they enjoyed their grandchildren and each other. They had 13 grandchildren by 1925, ranging from infant to 20 years old, and each one was precious to them. They traveled a bit during these years, taking trips to San Francisco to visit Emily, who had become a successful artist with a studio of her own. They went to Reno to see Samuel's workshop, where he employed 15 people and produced equipment that was used across the western states. They visited Sarah and Robert, who had 5 children and a happy life centered around education and community service. But they always came back to the ranch, to the land that had been their home for over 40 years, to the house they had built with their own hands. This was where they belonged, where their story had unfolded, where they wanted to finish their days. In 1928, they celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller this time, just immediate family, but it was no less meaningful. They sat around the big table in the dining room they had added onto the house years ago, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and Josephine looked around at all these faces, all these people who existed because she and Thomas had found each other. "I have been thinking a lot about that day in the snow," she said during the dinner. "About how close I came to dying, about how different everything would be if Thomas had ridden a different direction that day, if he had been even a few minutes later. It makes me believe that some things are meant to be. We were meant to find each other. We were meant to build this family, this legacy." "Here, here," James said, raising his glass. "To Mom and Dad who taught us all what love and hard work can accomplish." As they all toasted and talked and laughed, Thomas squeezed Josephine's hand under the table. No words were needed. After 45 years together, they could communicate volumes with a touch, a look, a shared smile. The 1930s arrived with economic depression gripping much of the country. But the ranch, built on years of careful management and diversification, weathered the storm better than many. They helped their neighbors when they could, sharing resources, offering work to men who needed it, proving that the community they had built over the decades was strong enough to withstand hard times. Thomas turned 70 in 1929, and Josephine was 72. They were old now, truly old, with white hair and bent backs and joints that ached in the cold. But they still rose with the sun, still walked the land they loved, still sat together every evening and talked about their day. In 1933, 50 years after Thomas had found Josephine in the snow, they decided to return to that place. James drove them out in his truck, following Thomas's directions to the spot where he had seen what he thought was a log in the snow. It looked different now in summer, covered in sagebrush and wildflowers, but Thomas swore this was it. They stood there together, holding hands, both of them thinking about that moment 50 years ago that had changed everything. "I can still remember exactly how you looked," Thomas said quietly. "Your face so pale, your lips blue from the cold. I was so afraid I was too late." "But you were not too late," Josephine said. "You were exactly on time. You gave me back my life, Thomas, and I like to think I gave you something too." "You gave me everything," he said simply. "Purpose, love, family, a reason to wake up every morning. Before you, I was just going through the motions. After you, I was truly alive." They stayed there for a long time, talking about the past and the present, about their children and grandchildren, about all the years they had shared. When James finally came to collect them, they took one last look at the spot where their story had begun, then turned toward the truck and the life they had built together. Thomas's health began to decline in 1934. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down that comes with age. He tired more easily, needed more rest. The doctor told them it was his heart, worn out after 75 years of beating, of working, of feeling. There was nothing to be done but make him comfortable. Josephine cared for him as he had once cared for her, with tenderness and devotion. She read to him, sat with him, held his hand. Their children and grandchildren came to visit frequently, and the house was often full of family, of love, of the continuation of what Thomas and Josephine had started. On a quiet evening in December of 1934, exactly 51 years after Thomas had found Josephine in the snow, he passed away peacefully in their bed, Josephine holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you. Thank you for saying yes." The grief was overwhelming. After 51 years of marriage, of being together every single day, Josephine felt like part of herself had died with Thomas. But she also felt gratitude for the long, beautiful life they had shared, for every moment they had been given. At his funeral, held at the ranch with hundreds of people in attendance, Josephine spoke about the man she had loved. "Thomas saved my life on a snowy December day in 1883, she said, her voice clear despite her tears. "But he did more than that. He gave me a reason to live. He showed me that hope can bloom even in the darkest moments, that love can transform everything. We built a life together that was richer and fuller than either of us could have imagined alone. He was my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. And while I will miss him every day for the rest of my own life, I am grateful beyond words for the 51 years we had together." Josephine lived for 6 more years after Thomas died. She stayed on the ranch, in the house they had built, surrounded by family. She watched her grandchildren grow up, met her great-grandchildren, and spent her days tending her garden and reading and remembering. She wrote additions to their story, chronicling their final years together, ensuring that every part of their journey was recorded. She wanted future generations to know not just the dramatic beginning, but the day-to-day reality of a love that had lasted over half a century, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow. On a spring morning in 1940, Josephine passed away peacefully in her sleep, 3 months before what would have been her 83rd birthday. They buried her next to Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could rest together under the Nevada sky they had both loved. At her funeral, James spoke about his parents. "They showed us what love looks like," he said. "Not the easy, romantic love of books and songs, but the deep, abiding love that weathers storms and builds futures. My father found my mother when she had given up hope, and he gave that hope back to her. And she gave it right back to him. Together, they created a legacy that will last for generations. This ranch, this family, the children they taught, the lives they touched, that is their gift to us all." The ranch continued under James's stewardship, then eventually under his children's and their children after that. The story of Thomas and Josephine became family legend, told and retold at gatherings. The tale of how a cowboy found a dying woman in the snow, and how their love built something that lasted long after they were gone. The journal Josephine had written was preserved carefully, passed down through the generations. And every December, on the anniversary of that fateful day when Thomas had found Josephine, the family would gather at the ranch to remember and celebrate the love story that had started it all. The snow fell. A woman gave up. A cowboy lifted her. And together they lifted hope, building a life and a legacy that proved that even in the darkest moments when all seems lost, salvation can appear. Love can bloom. Hope can be restored. And from the ashes of despair can rise something beautiful and lasting, something worth fighting for, something worth believing in. That was the story of Thomas Reeves and Josephine Kerrigan, a love born in snow and hardship, nurtured through years of work and dedication, and lasting far beyond their mortal years. They had saved each other in that moment on the frozen Nevada desert, and in doing so, they had created something that would live on forever in the hearts and memories of all who came after them. Their story was one of resilience and hope, of the power of love to transform lives, of the beauty that can emerge when two people choose to face the world together rather than alone. It was a story that began with despair and ended with joy, that started with giving up and finished with building something lasting. And on winter evenings, when the snow fell softly over the ranch that still bore their names, it was said you could almost see them there. A tall cowboy and his beloved wife, walking hand in hand across the land they had made their own, their love as eternal as the stars above them, their hope as enduring as the mountains on the horizon. This was their legacy. This was their gift. And this was proof that even when you are ready to give up, even when you are certain all is lost, hope can still appear to lift you from the darkness and carry you home.